So hello, I think that the live stream has started. I see it noted on my screen. Welcome everyone from around Europe or maybe beyond for this session, which will be led by Danielle Zucker. I will introduce her in a short moment. I will first introduce myself. My name is Denis de Grote. I'm heading Brussels AI, which is the Brussels-based declination of CTI. We are present in about 100 cities around the world. And our aim is really to, federate and organize events so that the community can gather around AI topics. And we've been doing this over the last 3 years with a lot of impact, a lot of success. And today I'm very happy that we can be part of Europe AI, which is hosted by AI for Belgium, that we have seen born under the initiative of the Belgian government. So very shortly, I will introduce Danielle Zucker, who is here with us. And Danielle is a doctor in psychology and also an experienced profiler of criminals with a very rich career. She trained with ex-FBI agents who continued to work, by the way, with the FBI. So that's always a bit prestigious. Always have the impression that I'm in some kind of Netflix series when I am in touch with Danielle. We've proposed to Danielle to elaborate today within this Europe AI week on a topic that is, for the moment, invested with AI, but as maybe you have followed the news in several countries, and especially in Belgium, it's not always easy to allow the police to use AI in detecting criminals, detecting criminal behavior, doing face recognition, these kind of things. There's a lot of questions that are always popping up when we talk about AI and criminality. And from the testimony of Danielle and her experience, she's also a published author with successful books. She will entertain us over the next 50 minutes on criminal behavior analysis or profiling, which is an investigative method that originated in the US, and the tool that was developed is based on the analysis of the behavior of the perpetrator at the crime scene. But she will explain that much better than me. We will then open up on the correlation with how AI can help optimize processes and efficiency in the future. I'm, of course, taking the opportunity to also talk about the 27th of April, because we will host with Brussels AI a big major event around the thematic of criminality. You can find all the information on our website, www.brusselsai.com, and we'll be more than happy to welcome people from around Europe. And Danielle is going to be one of our keynotes as well during that day with some other international keynote speakers. Danielle, over to you, and happy to have done the introduction this way.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. My problem is I can't. It's a bit. Voilà. Okay. Hello, everyone. I know I'm in front of an artificial intelligence audience, and I must admit that I don't know anything about it. So my apologies. There are 2 computerized programs in the profiling field where I'm sure there could be some room for improvement. I won't get into details, but I will mention them at the end of the presentation. Just a little word about how I got in the profiling field. It was more an accident than a real personal decision. I was the head of a psychiatric emergency unit of a general hospital, and there I've seen a lot of women being raped and young girls. And I was a judicial expert for the Justice Department for victims. And a bit later, they asked me to be a judicial expert for offenders. But I didn't know anything about about sexual offense, about the offenders. So I decided to go and look for a training. So after Canada, I went to United States to meet Roy Hazelwood and his colleagues. Roy Hazelwood was one of the pioneers in the profiling field, and he was a special agent from the FBI. So I was accepted among all those guys, FBI, a special agent, and all pioneers in the profiling method. I remember the first time I got there, the first week I was terrified because I had to look to pictures and to listen to records and look at pictures. So, and then the next week, I don't know how, but I felt just at home. And that was really very strange. It was like my American family. But I went there to be a better judicial expert, and I came back to Brussels being a beginner profiler. Afterwards, I had a continuous training for almost 10 years. It helped me a lot to investigate on rape and murder cases, and today I added a new specialty, and that is moral and sexual harassment at work. So what is exactly profiling? It's an investigative tool to assist the police in complex cases. When all investigative duties have been completed and there is no elucidation, then this method can be used, and it is very interesting. But in no way profiling is replacing those classical methods used by the police. So it's just another tool, another perception. Profiling is not like in TV series or movies. It's not like Netflix, where you see the profiler on the crime scene. And this is not the way I was trained, because we come afterwards. And on the series, you see all those profilers, they have some visions, and you could think they are with delusions, they get into the mind of the criminal and so, okay, this is, profiling is much less glamorous, really. You are in your office analyzing thousands and thousands of documents. What are the basics of profiling? And before answering this question, I would like to ask you another question. Have you ever noticed that our first tendency is to believe someone who is speaking? So you will believe the person with the words and his way of talking. The first tendency is to believe. I'm not saying that you need to become a paranoiac, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that sometimes it can have serious consequences. For instance, if you have a rapist that is in front of a judge and in court, which is quite rare, but if you do have this rapist and he's 20 years old, and there is a lots of evidence, and he's saying to the judge, I didn't realize what I was doing. This is the first time, and I'm so sorry. And of course, I won't do it again. So the judge might believe him, and you want to give the man a second chance, and especially he's so young. So this is the question: how do you know that this rapist is raping for the first time, knowing that research says that 70% of the rapists are serial rapists, and that the average age to commit the first rape is around 13 years old. So when this man, 20 years old, comes in front of a judge, how do you know it's his first rape? this is a very difficult question. So the only way to understand if it is the first rape or not is to analyze his behavior on the crime scene. And this is why the fundamental principle of profiling is based on the fact that the behavior doesn't lie. You may say all kinds of things, but your behavior will betray you. Just a comment in general, the offender can be a male or a female, and the victim can be a male or a female. I won't repeat this in my presentation. So I want to show you how behavior can talk about the offender. If you decide to kill your neighbor and you go in your neighbor's apartment, you go in his kitchen, you take a knife and you're stabbing his chest 16 times, then you leave and you are identified by other neighbors and by some people in the street. And then you have another person who is inviting the neighbor and then to dinner, and then he's inviting him for a walk. And then he decides to take him in a secluded area where he kills him, and then he dumped the body on a road, let's say. Well, you will see that these two behaviors are very different, and that you can deduce variables that are very different. You can infer characteristics of those two persons on basis of their behavior. The way they commit the crime speaks about them. By analyzing behavior, we can know how you think. And by knowing how you think, we can say who you are. So where do we look for the criminal behavior? On the crime scene. But just before, I would like to tell you a few words about the history of this method, because it's quite fun. So in 1940, there was a man named George Metesky, and he has put a first bomb on the window of the Con Edison building in New York. The bomb didn't explode, and there was a message saying, bunch of crooks, you, Con Edison. And he placed another 4 bombs, and it's only the 4th that exploded. But then afterwards, until 1957, he has placed 41 bombs around New York, in cinemas, in theaters, libraries. So people were really very, very scared. It just stopped during Second War. But then afterwards, he started again. So this was a very difficult situation for the police, and they went to a psychiatrist that was already working with the FBI. His name was James Russell, and they asked him if he would accept to work on the case, which he accepted, but very reluctantly, because he knew that if he failed, his reputation would be ruined. So, but Russell went to work on that case and came out with a profile, and a very, very specific profile, saying where an area, a spatial area where they called him the Mad Bomber. So where the Mad Bomber could live, that he was living with his family. He gave the age of the Metesky, and he said he was very low educated. He was coming from countries of the East, and then he said, and you will see when the police will arrest him, he will be with a suit, a double buttoning, because this is how decent men at that time are dressing. So this is how he will appear. So the police finally arrest him, and when he opened the door, he was in his pajamas. So he asked if he could go upstairs and dress. And when he got down to the police, he was wearing that suit with a double buttoning. So you see, it was very, very, very precise. Then in 1972, there was police had taken this kind of analysis of the crime, and there was a special unit that was created. But in 1982, Reagan had created the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime in the FBI. And there were I don't know, 5, 6 pioneers. And they did also statistic research, and that is very, very interesting because we use it all the time. And how they got those results, they went into prison to talk to the criminals that were life imprisoned. So it didn't change their life to give interviews. And so they could ask them, why do you do this? How long are you prepared to drive to find a victim? Why do you go to that place? Why do you did this, and so on? And so they really had a huge research on 40 years that allowed us to understand much better the offenders, the criminals. So you have to know 2 things about profiling. First, it works with hypotheses and probabilities. And so it's a bit a cultural shock with the police because they work with evidence. So it's always a bit difficult, but anyway, profiling works with hypotheses, probabilities, and it is a scientific approach. You have a hypothesis, you are constructing it very slowly, and then you have to verify it if it's true or not. And the other characteristic is profiling gives leads and no names. It's very rare that you give a name in a file. You give leads, and those leads are supposed to help the police to identify the offender. So the utilization of profiling during the investigation is to, as I said, establish a profile, establish links between different cases, sorting between several suspects, help with interrogations, identify what type of event occurred, because it can be a crime, a murder, it can be a suicide, or it can be also autoerotic fatalities, or perhaps even something else. Then you have also before the trial, if you want to deepen certain aspects like where their accomplices, what was the planification, what was the degree of planification. So you can deepen certain aspects. And then, of course, the cold cases. What is exactly a profile? Many people imagine that a profile is actually a psychological profile, but it won't help the police if you say, okay, this guy is a paranoid or a schizophrenic. It won't help them. So it's not a psychological profile. Even if we give a psychological profile, it is more used during the interrogation, but not to identify really the offender. So what we do give is an age range. This is the most difficult part because there is also the criminal maturity, and criminal maturity is not the same as age. Because if you have an offender that started his criminal career at, I don't know, age 7, because he he killed some animals, and then he had a violent behavior with his friends or with his family, and he did some thefts and so on. And then around 13 years old, he raped. So at the age of 20, you could say, okay, we suppose that he is between 25 and 30 because he has such a important criminal experience. So when the profile fits someone, but the age is not correct, we still apply the profile. So there is also the comfort zone. We can determine a comfort zone, and what's a comfort zone? Usually the home of the offender, where he feels comfortable, and he knows streets, a few streets around his home, or around his school, or around I don't know, where his grandmother lives, or where he used to go to vacation. So it's an area where he knows a lot of little streets around to be able to flee. So he feels comfortable in this area. And the more you know about those little streets, the more easier it will be to flee. Profiling helps also to determine if the offender could have a criminal record or if he is already known by the police. So we can see with his behavior if he specialized in some other criminal activity. For instance, rapists are the ones who commit the most non-sexual crimes. In a study conducted by Anne Davies in Scotland Yard, and who is confirmed by BKA in Germany and in America, all kinds of research shows that rapists are committing, besides the rapes, they are also committing a lot non-sexual crimes. With those three elements, age, comfort zone, and criminal record, the police can go to work. And but the profile can give a lot more of information, of course, about the offender, like is he living alone? What kind of job he's doing, what could be his hobby, sometimes what car is he driving, or is he driving a car? So the list can be really long depending on the profiler experience. How profiling works? Well, on a crime scene, you have two types of traces. Physical traces, so fibers and DNA and fingerprints and so on. And then you have the behavioral traces. How did the criminal commit this particular crime in this particular location on this particular time with this particular victim in the way he did it? So these are all choices he made, and he leaves on the crime scene his ID or his mental map. Every behavior is a trace. When a murderer is being identified by many witnesses before and after his killing, when he leaves a lot of DNA on a crime scene, if all the behavior elements converge in the same direction, you can deduce that you have that the offender is quite young and not yet known by the police, who is not living further than 2 kilometers. That means 1 mile and 2 around the crime scene. And why is that? How can we infer that? Well, he has probably no experience, because otherwise he would already know that you need to take some precautions not to be identified, and you may not leave your DNA on a crime scene, otherwise you can be identified. So either he is very young, either, and this is the hypothesis, either it's an offender with some psychiatric issues. And of course, you cannot rely on a single behavior to make deductions. You need to have a cluster of behaviors going in the same direction. The crime scene analysis, we analyze every document, every single behavior on the crime scene, the type of crime, the victim, the location that we need to visit, of course. We interview again all the witnesses and the victims if they're still alive, in order to finally establish a profile. We have to take into account the following elements: the autopsy report, the autopsy photos, the medical reports, the photos of the crime scene, the fingerprints that may have been found, the DNA traces, the toxicology reports, any recordings, the trajectory of the shots, ballistic reports, security reports, tire tracks, urbanistic study, climatic study, soil study, and the list is endless depending on the case. We will dissect the behavior. Everything must be analyzed, and here are some examples. How the perpetrator approached his victim, by cunning, by surprise, using immediate violence or something else. How he controlled the victim, with a weapon, by his presence, by threats, by physical force. What was the level of the physical force? We have a scale for that to measure it objectively. And we of course analyze the traces left on the bodies such as scratches, fractures, or death. Did the victim resist? What was the reaction of the offender to the victim's resistance? Did he adapt? Did he comply? Did he threaten? Did he become more violent? What type of injury was inflicted, and when? Was it inflicted before the death or after the death? If the victim was injured, what type of injury? On what part of the body? With what weapon or object? If the victim was tied up, where were the ties placed? The type of knot that was used, very important. The tools that were used. If it is a sexual crime, if an object was inserted in an orifice, which one and what object? If there are traces of blood, it is necessary to understand the way the blood was reflected in the space and on the victim. So in a sexual crime, did the perpetrator present sexual dysfunction? Because this happens. And what was the sequence of sexual acts that was committed? Because certain sequences are more humiliating, even more humiliating than others. The verbal activity of the perpetrator must be analyzed. Did he request also that the victim says something? And when was that? In which sequence was that? Did the perpetrator change his attitude? If yes, when? And what could have triggered this change? Were there objects stolen? Were there suspicious behavior before or after the crime? what were the precautions that were used to avoid identification as gloves or mask or disguise or anything. We need to analyze the degree of exposure to risk for both the perpetrator and the victim. There are victims who are more vulnerable or naive and present a personality where they could be a prey for that kind of individual because they are naive or more vulnerable. It is a psychological functioning that is perceived by the offender. And if with any judgment, a victim decides to follow the future criminal without knowing him and accept to go, I don't know, in his apartment, and there is no judgment, but then she is a victim with a high degree of exposure. Prostitutes and drug addicts, hitchhikers are also at high risk. If the perpetrator attacks a victim with a high risk rate, we will not infer the same variables as if he attacks a victim with a low risk exposure rate. And you can have a victim with a low exposure rate that turns into a high rate because the environment has changed. For instance, if her car isn't working anymore and the victim is in a dark environment and alone on a little road somewhere, then the victim becomes a high risk exposure. All this is very important to assess. And the same exercise is applied to the offender. What is the degree of risk he had to take to approach the victim, to control her, and to commit the crime, and then to flee? And in those different phases, you don't have always the same rate. So for instance, you can have an offender. There was a victim on a parking lot and she was putting her groceries in the trunk, and the offender came behind and pushed her in the trunk. He took the car of the victim, took her in a secluded area, raped her and killed her. So we may say that the victim was a low exposure rate because she was on a parking lot and there were lots of people, but the offender was in a high rate exposure. But then it changed to commit his crime and to flee. He took a low risk exposure. So all this gives us information about the functioning of the offender. From all these behaviors, it is possible to infer whether the victim was selected or not. The choice of the victim gives us elements to understand what relationship the perpetrator and the victim might have had or have. So the choice of the location is also a very important information because you need to ask yourself, why this location? Is it a choice or an opportunity? The location must be analyzed on a map. Of course, you need to go there, but afterwards you need to analyze it on a map, and it is necessary to understand the topography of the place, the density of the population, if it is a commercial or a residential area. It is fundamental to go to every place where the offender went or did something. For example, let's imagine that the offender proposed to his future victim to go to a bar, and then he kidnaps her and he kills the victim in another place, and then he decides to abandon the body in a wood. It will be necessary to visit all the places that we know about because this will allow us to understand his geographical map. So there was the location, the verbal activity and the tone that is used, what was said, what did he ask the victim to say and when, because there are some offenders, they have a scenario in their head, and so they ask the victim to say all kinds of things. It is also necessary to add the victimology. So this is the knowledge, the really very profound knowledge of the victim's life. So you need to analyze everything and get into her intimacy. All those behaviors must be classified, and there are 3 types of behaviors. Modus operandi, you know all about it, I suppose. But this is the set of behaviors that are necessary to commit a crime. So all what is necessary to commit the crime. This is important. And it changes. Why? Because the criminals, they are like us, they improve in what they do. So sometimes they found that a particular behavior is more efficient than the previous one. So the modus operandi is changing. And it changes almost every 3 months. So that makes it quite difficult. Then you have the rituals, and the rituals is the set of behavior that are not necessary to commit the crime. They don't change as much as the modus operandi because they're linked to the fantasy scene. And the fantasy scene, some offenders have a fantasy scene that is very active, and some doesn't because they're more impulsive. But you can have a criminal with a fantasy scene that is very active, and so he will try to translate in reality what he has in his fantasy. I heard and I watched a video of a criminal that was saying that he was there in his chair, and he was explaining that he would abduct a victim, get her in his home in a special room, and that he will do all kinds of things to her. And he did all that. He just did exactly what he said he would do, and then he killed her. So the fantasy is really, for some criminals, very important because they're trying to live their fantasy, and that they're like a film director. They're giving themselves a role really to fuel something of their image. So they need to have a certain image of themselves, and they act their fantasy. So there is always a gap between fantasy and reality, and this is why also they start again. However, we should not expect all the aspects of the modus operandi and the rituals every time in every crime, because there is one element that is very important, and it is the mood of the offender. So sometimes he's not in the mood to do certain things, and so he's not doing them. And there can be also the problem with the time, or something went wrong, or so you won't have the whole modus operandi or the ritual. Behaviors can therefore be adapted, modified, or interrupted by an unforeseen external event. Now, the third behavior is the signature, and this is a unique combination of behavior. Let's say a bite on the chin, I don't know, 5 stabs in the chest, and he took off a finger. So this could be a unique combination of behavior that you would not find somewhere else. So a signature is quite rare, really. What can these behaviors tell us about the fantasy of the perpetrator? Fantasy is so important to get in the functioning of the criminal, and if we get into his functioning, so we understand better who he is and where he is. We can understand what the perpetrator is looking for and what is the image of himself he is looking for. What are the sensations he is looking for? What scene he is trying to play, and what is the role he gives himself? So in conclusion, it is the combination of all these elements that will allow us to understand what happened, how it happened, and who is capable to commit this crime the way it was committed. This method analyzes each case in its uniqueness and uses also the statistics. Profiling is a logical and deductive reasoning based on facts and nothing else than facts. So now the two computerized, I can't find it anywhere. All right. I can't find it here. I hope you still see it. The VI class, the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, is a computerized tool. It's a computerized tool to make links between cases. VI-class does not replace investigators, but it helps them a lot. Especially by comparing a lot of data that is difficult to manage by the human mind alone. What does the database contains? It includes data on the victim, description, lifestyle, and the known or unknown perpetrator. Again, description, sexual habits, modus operandi, the means used, transport, weapons, precautions, the descriptions of the crime scene, the facts, the interaction between the offender and the victims. It is based on a questionnaire of 156 items, and it is unfortunately in Belgium, the police agent is not obliged to fill in the questionnaire, while in Canada, they are obliged. And if you don't fill in the questionnaire, so there is not enough data to be efficient. But there is one problem with this tool, and it is the large number of items that makes the cases too specific, and which reduces the possibility of making links between cases. In addition, it increases the risk that investigators will code differently. So we have not yet succeeded in exploiting its full potential. I gave here the name of the author of the article, an interesting article that explained this very well. The other tool is the geographic profiling created by Kim Rosmo. He's a Canadian psychologist. And it's a computerized geographic profiling algorithm which assess the spatial characteristic of the crimes. It analyzes the geographic coordinates of the offender's crimes and produces a color map which assigns probabilities to different points for the most likely area of the offender's home base. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
So thank you, Danielle. We couldn't see your last slide, so I don't know if that was the intention. So we just...
Oh, not at all.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry about that.
So I guess if there's still a few minutes left, if the audience wants to, ask questions to Danielle about specific topics and how, artificial intelligence, how systems, how data can for sure, improve the quality of profiling and detect earlier on intentions and behavior. But of course, with due regard to privacy and all the complexity that comes with it. Mm-hmm. Most of these questions will be answered on our Brussels AI event on the 27th of April. But probably some of you have maybe some questions to ask. So you can put the question in the chat, or you can just take over, unmute and introduce yourself. There's a question here from Vandy that asks, Danielle, could you give the name of the two tools you have mentioned?
So it's the VI class. So it's a violent crime linkage analysis system. So it's a pity I can't. So you can't.
You can write it in the chat.
You can't see it?
No.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, now we have it. My class.
Okay. Here.
This was tool. Any other questions from the audience? Tom says we can't unmute ourselves. So I don't know if our technical support can do anything about this. Now it seems it's possible. So maybe, Tom, you can try it again. I can do it for him.
Yes, it's working now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hello, I'm a computer sciences student at the University of Namur. So with the amount of data growing every year, isn't the job of profiler more difficult in general?
I didn't get the beginning of your sentence.
Okay, so with the amount of data growing every year, isn't the job of profiler more difficult, generally speaking?
Which data are you speaking about?
Data about the offenders, for example. Well, is it growing? Is the data of the offenders growing also with the amount of data in general growing every year?
No, because as I said, this byclass, the police are not obliged to fill it in, so the data is not growing.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other question?
It's not growing as it could, I would say.
I have one question for you, Danielle, because the actuality in Belgium, has clearly put at the forefront of the news the issue of privacy with the Clearview system that the police was using for face detection.
Yes.
What's in your view the future of this? Do you believe, if it's considered being a support, then it should be used? And if not, what alternatives do you see?
It's a difficult question because it's an ethical question too. We need to find a balance between those tools that are very effective and that we need to identify the criminals. But the problem is that it is une atteinte à notre vie privée. I don't know, how do you call it in English? For your private life, it's an intrusion in your private life. So this is the balance we have to find. And
is it so different from a policeman that has a series of pictures, printed pictures, and is trying to look at people to see if he recognizes someone, versus a system that helps him do this? In the end, it's only another technology.
Yes, you're right. But the question is also, what are they doing with all the information they have? And this is really the question. It's the same with the DNA bank, the problem to have all those profiles, and it's who have access to it, what are they doing with it? That's the real who and what are they doing. So with all those information, of course, if it serves only to identify criminal people, this is all right. But if it serves to enhance the data that they could have about everybody in a society, this is a real problem.
So it's a permanent conflict, you say, between, in the end, we want to solve more cases and
yes.
to anticipate more, better, what could possibly turn into criminality, versus how far do we want to go to protect our,
yes. For instance,
our own privacy.
Yes, and for instance, it's very interesting on the DNA bank. In England, they have a huge DNA bank with 3 million profiles. They're doing 600 or 700 match every week. You can imagine, this is incredible. So, but if someone crossed the red line, the red light, sorry, they ask for your DNA. So this is the price to pay, you see. I don't know if you're ready to do that. If you cross the red light, you have to give your DNA and it stays in the bank. So yeah, but on the other side, you have 700 matches a week. It's a tough question.
Yes, it is. It's a tough question, and these kind of answers are very complex, and that gives me the opportunity to make a final call on the audience that is interested to join our event on the 27th of April. So just go on our website, www.brusselsai.com. One of the other keynotes next to Daniel is Imam Hok, and Imam Hok is the founder and chief evangelist of Quantexa. And Quantexa is specialized in data-driven AI solutions with a focus on decision intelligence, graph analytics. And since he started that company, which has really significantly grown, Imam and his team have been able to save billions in tax evasion and fraud. So it's a bit further away from the area of Daniel, but then again, he will be able to clarify how a platform can solve major challenges across data management and financial crime. And it will be complemented also by two professors that will illustrate all of that. So on this, Daniel, I want to thank you for your intervention. Unless there are, there is another question, sorry. Two other questions. Do the data present on social media, are they being used in profiling?
Of course.
Clear answer.
Of course, that's the first thing we're going to look at.
Okay. And then the second question from Stefania concerns the relationship between causality and correlation. As you have explained, Daniel, the level of attention to avoid misinterpretation is very high during your work as a psychologist. Do you think that AI systems can make mistakes in this respect?
Yes, of course. Yes, and that's this is also a problem with artificial intelligence. It can make mistakes.
Yes.
Yes.
The bias is in the system.
Yes, and this is why there must be a collaboration between human and artificial intelligence, but you can't just leave artificial intelligence to do the investigation or to do whatever. I don't think this will work. It must stay a tool.
Okay, I see that's it. Everybody says thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to all attendees from us. And I hope to see you. We hope to see you the 27th of April. Have a nice day all.
Bye-bye.